Welcome to Your City Connections, where you get to meet entertaining and informative guests. Guests such as an artist with a brush or with a camera, and a guest with a violin. City Connections, providing insightful interviews with favorite son Lieutenant Governor Todd Lamb, to city commissioners, the mayor, interviews with a rodeo queen, to beauty queen, and even an NBA player. Now, join Steve Keim as he discusses another engaging topic on City Connections.
Hello, I'm Steve Keim, and welcome to We Remember, as in we remember our veterans. I have a special guest today, but before I introduce him to you officially, I'd like to just share a little bit about my special guest. And again, our whole emphasis this month as we air this program is to honor our veterans that have served and have served our great country. Well, I hope he doesn't mind, but I want to let you know that my special guest is 91 years old. He graduated from Billings High School, so we're neighbors. I grew up in Perry, Oklahoma, and he grew up in Billings. He graduated from high school in 1941. And then he graduated at Oklahoma State in 1967. So there's a few years there that it took him to finish school, and we'll talk about that. My special guest today is a Marine. He served in the Marine Corps. He also served World War II in the Pacific, and he's also a Bronze Star recipient. He has a very special, notable brother. His brother is named Henry, and Henry served in the Marines also in the Pacific, and Henry was a Silver Star recipient. By the way, Henry was our first Republican governor in the state of Oklahoma, and I think that took place back in 1962. And back when my special guest was a senior, he was in his last semester at Oklahoma State University in 1951. He got another phone call, and it was folks saying, hey, Korean War is taking place and I need you. So he was unable to finish his last semester at Oklahoma State to go to the Korean War. But finally, in 1967, he graduated from Oklahoma State University, and it took him, for 4 years of school, it took him 26 years to cram all that information in there. But ladies and gentlemen, my special guest is George Bellmon, one of the most humble guys that I know. And I appreciate George being on the set today. So please welcome to We Remember Our Veterans, George Bellmon. George, thanks for being here. Boy, that's still a strong handshake you got there. And that's all from the Marines, right?
Milking cows.
I was going to say, how we got connected, I'd like to remind our audience is that you're at First Baptist Church in Enid, and you're getting ready to go to Washington, D.C. on that honor flight. And so that's how George and I got introduced. But one thing that I shared with him, I said, George, back in the 70s, I used to haul hay at your brother's farm. It was the governor's farm that I would haul hay on. So that's how we got introduced several months ago, and I appreciate George being with us today as we remember our veterans. George, right off the bat, why did you enlist? This is in, 1941 or so. Why did you enlist?
As you mentioned, Steve, I graduated from high school in 41. And I enrolled at Oklahoma A&M, as it was in those days, as a freshman. And it was during this year, on a Sunday morning, there was two other boys and I were sitting in the Aggie drugstore on the campus at A&M, right directly diagonally across the street from the college fire station. Anyway, they had a little radio up on the shelf on the wall. And while we were sitting there drinking a Coke, it came on the radio that they had bombed Pearl Harbor. And we looked at each other, and none of us had ever heard of Pearl Harbor. We didn't know what was going on. And I think it was probably a couple of hours later before we actually realized the significance of what was going on. But there was an awful lot, and it took over the air, as you know, and right. There was an awful lot went on, and many of us in my age group, we realized that our lifestyle was going to be changing pretty quick. But anyway, that's how it started with me. I was young and physical, as most of us my age were, and I felt very strongly that I needed to go, and most of us did, and nearly everybody was eager to serve. And it took quite a while for them to get the draft organized.
Right.
I don't remember the length of time, but anyway, I had an older brother, Henry, who had just graduated from A&M, and by having a degree, he was able to enlist in the Marine Corps and enter their officers' training back at Quantico, Virginia, which he did. He was there for 12 weeks, and then he was transferred back into California. And as he came back through Oklahoma, he stopped at home for a day or two. And when I seen him in that uniform, then that did me in.
That sealed the deal, huh?
But I was confronted with a situation. My father was in his late 60s in those years, and he needed help there at home.
Sure.
And by rights, I probably should have stayed, but I couldn't handle it, and the draft wasn't organized. But in order for me to enlist, I had to be released by our local draft board, and they released me, and I went and I enlisted in the Marine Corps, and served during the war.
And your story is very familiar and similar to many other, families in this country back in 1941 and 42 that they had this decision: do I stay home and keep the family together and help our parents on the farm? Do I work, or do I go serve my country? And so you were faced with that decision, and so many other individuals. And I know of my dad, he joined the Navy in 42, but he was also on the farm, and they had a lot of cows to milk and firewood to chop and stuff like that. But he was torn with, well, do I stay and help my parents, or do I go with my brothers and join the service? So there was a lot of different challenges and decisions to be made at that time. You're a part, as they phrase it, the greatest generation. You've heard that term. I think a news person, Tom Brokaw, I think, had mentioned the World War II generation. They call it the greatest generation. When you hear that term, George, what does that mean to you?
Well, I've thought about it some, and as time goes on, the more it has more meaning to me all the time. But when we think about it, probably our birth date had a whole lot to do with that. Steve, do you understand?
Right.
We came along at a time that was unique. I started to school at the age of 6 in 1930, and that was the very beginning of the Depression. We didn't realize, we thought everything was normal as young boys, know. And we didn't suffer. We had plenty to eat, but there weren't any luxuries, I'll tell you that. There wasn't any luxuries. We wore a lot of hand-me-downs, and it seemed like the clothing in those days weren't like they are today. Yeah. We couldn't dress for the weather, and when I really think about it, maybe we were the greatest generation.
I think...
and I say that without being critical.
Well, sure. Listen, you're one of the most humble guys I know, so I know...
I admire so much the generations since. I admire the young people, and I particularly think about the ones that have served in the military. They have had a terrible disadvantage to me.
Yeah.
They have had to serve, and they have been subjected to, all the unusual devices, explosions and all, and we had advantages in World War II, which I'll talk about a little later. But
well, when I think of the greatest generation, I just think of, in my case, my parents. Is my dad, he goes off to join the Navy in World War II, but my mom went to California, and she was one of those, Rosie the Riveter ladies. And so besides young men and women going off to serve our country, the families that stayed, they all sacrificed as well. And so when I think we hear that term of the greatest generation, that encompasses that entire generation of how people, how they sacrificed. And even though maybe they didn't go to the Pacific or to Europe, but they stayed back in the U.S., either working or just sacrificing certain things. You mentioned about the Depression, and I remember my dad telling me stories because he was born in 1925. So you and my dad were raised during the Depression era. So how do you think that time impacted you in your character and in who you are? Now, you said that you had plenty to eat, but you didn't have a lot of luxuries. How did that living in the Depression impact you? Did it just keep things simple in life?
Absolutely. I think about that, and I came through it, and looking back, I'm kind of glad that I lived during that time and was at that age. We learned to get by, and we lived on the farm, of course, and we had plenty to eat. We had the advantage that we had we butchered our own beef and our own pork, and we had chickens in the garden, and we had a lot of advantages that maybe other folks didn't have. But we learned to get by, and we worked, Steve. We learned to work pretty young ages. My parents worked hard, and as boys, we did what we could. We'd done a lot in the wintertime, we'd trapped coons and possums and skunks, and would skin them and stretch their hides on a board and let them cure for a few days, and we'd sell them, and maybe for $1.50. But $1.50 would buy more groceries in those days.
Yeah, a lot more than it did so now. Go ahead.
You go ahead.
My special guest today on We Remember, our Veterans Day show, is George Bellmon. I appreciate George being with us today. And we just want to say thank you to all of our men and women that have served our country. And I appreciate George stopping by the Enid Television Network studios today to share his experiences about growing up, but also a little bit about his experiences during World War II, being part of that greatest generation. Now, George, I want to talk a little bit about your brother later on, and then talk just briefly. Now, you served in the Marine Corps. You earned, or you were a recipient of a Bronze Star. You said the other day that we could talk about some of the islands that you had served on. What are some islands that come to mind? Because I know you were in the Pacific. So,
well, I first went to. We left San Diego and went directly to Guadalcanal, where we trained for several months. And then, during this time we were there, the 6th Marine Division was formed, and I had been a member of the 29th Regiment, the tank company, but we became a part of the 6th Marine Division. And I think it was March the 1st, 1945, we left Guadalcanal and went directly to Okinawa. And we made the landing there on April 1st, 1945. And the operation itself lasted 83 days. The island was declared secure on June the 23rd. And from there, we had a rest camp on Guam, and we went to Guam and spent less than a week, and we got orders to go aboard ship. And the ship was late, but we finally got on the ship and we went to Japan. And this was, they dropped that first bomb, and we were on the water, I think, when they dropped the second one. Wow. And we made the initial landing there, and we went in combat loaded because we couldn't trust them in those days.
Sure.
As we pulled into Tokyo Bay, we could see some white flags along the shoreline, but yet and all, we couldn't trust them. But we were there in Japan for, I think, 3 weeks only, and we done a lot of disarming there, and we left and went back to Guam, spent just a very few weeks, and got orders then to go aboard a ship, and we went to Tsingtao, China, where we disarmed a lot of the people. The Reds, you might remember, were taken over along about that time, and it was confusing. Everything was confused, and frankly, I never could figure out just exactly what we did there. It was kind of disorganized.
Yeah. Well, let's shift gears a little bit, and you have a very notable brother, older brother. We can point that out. He's much older than George, but no, Henry Bellmon, our first Republican governor, and I believe he won office in 1962. You told me the other day that you had no inkling that this guy would ever be governor or run for governor. Why would you say that?
Well, I mean it. I grew up with Henry, of course, and never did he ever say anything that would indicate he had any interest in politics or ever running for office. Now, this was in our younger years. During the last 2 years before he became a candidate, I wasn't with him. I was living in North Carolina at the time, but I had no idea that but I might be wrong, but I understand that during the election in 1960, the Republican Party had difficulty in trying to come up with a candidate for governor. And after a lot of deliberation, they decided that he ought to run. And I think he was pretty reluctant to do it, but he consented to do it. And of course, the rest is history.
Yeah. Now, George, I hope you don't mind. I tell our viewing audience that George has a very special skill. This guy's very articulate, just a real, sharp individual. But he has special driving skills because when his brother, Henry, was running for governor, George is driving the car all over the state of Oklahoma. Now, that's according to George. So you have the special skill of getting behind the wheel and driving all over the state. And what's a story that comes to mind when you're driving your brother Henry as he's campaigning for governor? Is there one particular story that comes to mind as you guys are driving across the state? He stopped everywhere, right? Both of you stopped and talked to everyone?
Henry was a hard campaigner. Now, he didn't miss a trick. We'd be driving along, and if there was a sawmill or a community sale or any kind of a congregation, he stopped. Yeah. If we went into a restaurant to eat, he would meet everybody there, and then he would go back in the kitchen, and he would meet everybody back there, the cooks and the dishwashers and all. He worked at it pretty hard. He was pretty efficient at campaigning. The other thing that I remember about it, some of his people, his advisors, told him not to go down to Little Dixie. Which is southeast part of Oklahoma. Yes. Yeah. Mainly because, as you know, it was Democrat all the way. And but he wouldn't have any part of that. He was going to campaign in every county in the state, which he did. But I remember we would go to some of those towns down in southeastern Oklahoma, and there might not be over 2 or 3 people show up at his. But he had a band that traveled with him, and they'd set up, and the band would play, and he would make his spiel to 2 or 3 people. And I couldn't help but admire him for doing that. But Henry's got a pretty thick skin. He's pretty thick-hided, and
sure.
And he's pretty determined and all of that. But anyway, it was an interesting 30 days that I spent there with him. And anyway, that's 2 of the things that I remember about him.
Well, those are great memories, and I appreciate you sharing them with our audience. Can you hang around for a couple more questions? You
Yes.
can? Okay. Our special guest today is George Bellmon, and we thank you for joining us on We Remember as we honor our veterans with our program today. We'll be back with George right after this. Welcome back to We Remember, our Veterans Day show that we're airing on the Enid Television Network. I'm Steve Keim, and my special guest today is George Bellmon. George, we've talked earlier today about your service as a Marine and during World War II, being part of the greatest generation. And also, you talked a little bit about your educational background. It took several years to finish at Oklahoma A&M, and a little bit about your brother, Henry. But you said something to me the other day, George. You said it's important that we remember. Why did you keep saying that statement to me over and over, that we need to remember?
Well, we do need to remember. I don't think we forget, but I sometimes wonder if we remember the way we should. We need to remember, first, I think, of all the lives that were...
A lot of sacrifice.
Absolutely.
A lot of sacrifice.
And we need to consider the families of these people, the wives and parents and friends, and we need to remember them.
And I appreciate you saying that, George, because the intent of our show today is, sure to highlight a couple stories of George Bellmon, but our purpose for our show today is to remember all those men and women that have served, that have given their lives, the ultimate sacrifice. And the little thing that we can do is put a little program together to say that we remember. And so I appreciate you sharing that. I know you're like me. You're a flag-waving American. You love the flag. You have a flagpole and your flag up. Why is the flag so important to you?
Well, it tends to make me remember things, a lot of things. It stands for a lot, and all we need to do is just think about in the past and what all went on. I look at the flag and I think about that, and I also think about the effort that was put forth at home here during that time. And the flag just reminds me. I'm a very appreciative man, and I think it's a result of having served during World War II, and I appreciate so much my life and what it's been, and I enjoy all of the comforts and the conveniences and all of this. And I don't fuss about the little things like a lot of people do, I'll tell you that. Yeah. Anyway, and I can tell you this, that after having served in overseas as I did and having gone through the Okinawan campaign, my yearn for adventure has been completely satisfied. Mm. I have no desire for adventure, but the flag reminds me of a lot of things, Steve. It does.
Well, George, I appreciate your time today. I appreciate your service. Thank you for serving our country. Thank you for being here today and sharing your story. And on Veterans Day, let me say Happy Veterans Day, and this program will air throughout the month of November. And we want to say Happy Veterans Day to all of our veterans. Do you have any closing comments? I don't have any further questions, but do you have a Veterans Day message to your fellow veterans? Do you have anything that you want to say?
I literally hadn't thought too much about it.
I kind of put you on the spot, and I apologize for that. But
anyway, Steve, I don't know how much time you got, but let me inject one thing that might not be appropriate, but right now, I think our country is witnessing something that's pretty significant. I think we're looking ahead pretty close by quite a transformation in our government. And anyway, I hope it'll work out for the best, I'm sure. And when it's all said and done, I would like to see veterans when it comes to a head after the election, and I would like to see veterans support our government fully.
Right.
I would like to see more American flags flying in veterans' residence. And I'd like to see them, if they're take a more active part in our government, providing they approve of it. And I hope the changes that's coming about will be beneficial, and I think they will.
Okay, very good. George, we got to close the show, and I appreciate the challenge that you've issued to all veterans. Let's get those flags out. Let's start waving those flags again. George Bellmon, my special guest on We Remember, our opportunity to honor our veterans this month as we air this program on the Enid Television Network. I appreciate George and his willingness to serve our country, and also his friendship and his willingness to be here today. And thank you for being with us here today on We Remember.